Welcome to the OC24 podcast, where we've taken some of the best talks and discussions from this year's 24-hour conference on global organised crime, which showcases some of the most interesting research into organised crime around the world. This episode is called The Illicit Mining and Trade of Extractives in Africa.
Welcome everybody to this panel discussion on the illicit mining and trade of extractives in Africa. I will be the moderator for this session. My name is Kiran Pereira. I'm the author of the book Sand Stories, Surprising Truths About the Global Sand Crisis and the Quest for Sustainable Solutions. I'm also the founder of Sand Stories. To set the context for this particular talk, Africa is growing at unprecedented rates, and it's being shaped by forces that are both familiar and new to us. Several recent studies have projected that by the end of this century, Africa will become the center of the world's urban future. It will be the only continent experiencing population growth, and 13 out of 20 of the world's largest urban areas will be in Africa. It will also house more than a third of the world's global population. So the question before us is, can we manage this growth in a way that benefits all of humanity and the rest of the natural world? Illicit mining and trading of minerals is a huge challenge. Today we have with us three fantastic speakers who will share their expertise with us, and I will introduce each person just before they speak. Each speaker will get about 10 minutes for their presentation, followed by ample time for a Q&A session. The entire duration of the event is 75 minutes. And as audience members, you are invited to present your questions in the Q&A box. If you have a very short question, then you can also raise your hands, and the team in the Secretariat will give you the opportunity to do that. But please make sure your questions are brief. If you'd like the questions to be addressed to a specific speaker, do mention that. Otherwise, I will assign them as I see fit. So our first speaker for today is Oluwole Ojewole. He has a PhD in urban and regional planning. He works as a coordinator for Central Africa for the Regional Organized Crime Observatory at the Institute of Security Studies. Over to you, Oluwole.
Thank you so much, Kiran. I am very delighted to be part of this meeting and then for the opportunity that has been extended to us as the HENACT program at the Institute for Security Studies. So I will just talk briefly about my recent research in the DRC, which has to do with coltan, mining and the illicit trading of it. And in terms of what is very, very important, which I believe our global audience are mostly aware about, is the fact that DRC is noted to be one of the wealthiest countries in the world in terms of natural endowments. And a prominent World Bank report estimates that that the mineral deposit in the DRC is in excess of $24 trillion in terms of its worth. And what is also striking for us, for anybody that has traveled to the DRC, is that in terms of development outcomes, this wealth is not reflected in the quality of life of the people. And I think that is the centrality of my message in the course of my presentation. So in the course of my research, one of the things that we have also discovered is the fact that what is undermining these development outcomes to properly reflect in terms of the quality of life of the people is as a result of transnational organized crime, which involve both the local actors and international business within the extractive sector. So I identified these 7 dimensions of organized crime in the DRC, which has a network of actors who are participating in the criminal economy. And the first thing is illegal mining. So basically, how does it work? Whether as a Congolese or as a foreign investor who is interested in the extractive sector, There are certain standards and rules that have been put in place by the legislative and policy framework in the country. But what we find out is that on many occasions, these are circumvented by the locals and even the foreigners themselves. So rather than getting the license to operate within the extractive sector, engaging in cartel mining as a strategic mineral, for instance, a lot of artisanal miners engage in what they call illegal mining. So they become illegal because they don't have the license to actually operate. And the second thing to this is counterfeiting. And this manifests in two dimensions: falsifying of documents, whether custom documents, border security documents, in getting these strategic minerals into neighboring countries, which have become transshipment corridor. Particularly in this regard, 4 countries have been identified, and those are Tanzania, Burundi, Uganda, and Rwanda. These are exit corridor through which these strategic minerals move and funnel into the global supply chain in terms of smuggling. And there's also the dimension of resource predation, which speaks about the predatory state practices among some of these countries that I just mentioned now, who have, some of them don't even have the coltan deposit at all, but they are declaring these minerals within their trade balance as minerals that are emanating within the country. So I tag these as predatory state practices. And then the next one is collusion, which takes place between within a network of actors, security and state actors, security forces, be it foreign businesses and local business people who are engaging within the cartel mining. And then there's fronting. Fronting actually undermines the local content law within the country, which provides for certain incentives for the Congolese people to be able to participate in the extractive sector. So what some of these foreign businesses do is that they look for Congolese people to front for them so that they can circumvent some of these local content law and do business as though they were Congolese people within the cartel supply chain. And the last is corporate corruption by middlemen and multinationals, which is actually going on as far as the cartel supply chain is concerned in the DRC. So this leads me in the direction of how the actors are relating with each other within this ring that you can see on the screen, which speaks about the mining and illicit trading of coltan in the DRC. So you have a multiplicity of actors who engage within these 7 dimensions that I've identified, and then they engage in different activities from resource predation to smuggling, corruption, fronting, counterfeiting, and collusion. And the interesting thing is that within this network analysis, there are actors that participate in multiple domains as far as this coltan mining and its illicit trading is concerned in the DRC. So I have some strategic recommendation, because what I think is striking for me in the course of this research is the fact that there is what I refer to as limited statehood in terms of driving the necessary extractive reform that is important within the DRC. The country is approaching the 2023 election now, and what is on the front burner for politicians of the country is actually how they are going to take hold of power. Whereas what is very, very important, which can be very, very vital in translating political capital to actually work to improve the quality of life of the people, is to drive extractive reform within the country. And I've identified what different actors are supposed to do under my recommendations. You can go to the recommendation page. So in terms of strategic recommendation that I've identified within the DRC, I've tried to put these in 4 dimensions in terms of what the Congolese government should be doing. In earlier slide, I've identified crime harms that are actually affecting the quality of life of the people and also creating environmental despoilation in Eastern DRC. So what is strategic is that there is a need for reform of the Congolese Environmental Agency that has the responsibility to enforce environmental impact assessment and implementation of environmental management plan by the extractive companies. This is one of the strategic policy and legislative framework that is being undermined by the actors, the criminal actors within the illicit mining and trading of coltan in the DRC. And it's also important for the civil society organization to train and equip observatory groups at the local level to validate or invalidate some of the certification audit reports that are coming from the government, from the state actors. And I conclude to say, against the backdrop of human and environmental harms associated with mining and illicit trading of coltan in the DRC, the approach to extractive reform in the country needs a fresh look. And addressing the lingering problems that my research has identified with respect to mining and illicit trading of coltan and associated impact in the Eastern DRC has become imperative, particularly to improve the quality of life of the people in that part of the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Oluwole. That was an enlightening presentation. It's quite striking to learn how much is lost in annual revenue from illicit trading and the mining, and because of corruption. I'm sure you will have plenty of questions at the end of the session. So thank you very much for this presentation.
Thank you so much.
Now, moving on to the next speaker. Our next speaker is Mohammed Dagar. He will talk about an underappreciated mineral that lies at the heart of development as we know it today. Mohammed is the regional coordinator for Eastern Africa for the ENACT Regional Organized Crime Observatory. Mohammed carries out ENACT research. He coordinates the provision of technical support and strategic engagement to stakeholders in transnational organized crime matters in the region. He has a master's degree in peace, conflict, and development studies from the Universidad Jaume I in Spain. Over to you, Mohammed.
Thanks, Kieran, and a very good day to the audience tuned in. My name, is Mohammed Dagar, and I work for the EU-funded ENACT program as the regional coordinator for Eastern Africa. I really want to pick up from where my colleague Oluwole left. Fascinating talk, by the way, Oluwole. And I want to talk about another natural resource, to talk about the mining and the trading of this resource. And this resource is sand. As you are aware, sand is used in almost every material thing that exists in today's world. And it's the second most used resource after water. But this commodity is controlled by criminal cartels that operate unabetted through the use of violence. I really want to take this opportunity to present to you the preliminary findings of my soon-to-be published paper on sand mining in Kenya. I will present these findings in two parts. The first part is how is this criminal market driven? And second is what impact does this market have on ecosystems and people's lives and their livelihoods? Now, we see that mining sand, unlike harvesting, is an irreversible process, and it is leaving permanent scars on damaged ecosystems and having a very negative impact to the environment. Mining a resource entails extracting it all. When we say gold mining, we are removing the gold in totality in a particular natural habitat that it exists. Harvesting, on the other side, indicates a cyclically replenishing cycle of a process. So while mining is exhaustive, harvesting is actually sustainable. And as a non-renewable resource, once sand is mined exhaustively, it simply never regenerates back because it takes a very long time, for sand to form in its natural habitat. And in Kenya, this is leading to the depletion of the sand reserves and degrading ecosystems. And the trade value chain of mining sand is directly associated with violence and unsustainable sources of income for the communities. When we look at the criminal market of sand here in Kenya, we see, for example, in a county where you have around 500 overloaded 10-ton sand trucks leaving that particular county in a day. This is equivalent to about 8,000 to 10,000 tons of sand living in one particular county in a day. And most of this sand is, of course, not legally mined or extracted. Still in another county, the research shows that, indicates that you have around over 200 overloaded lorries that leave that particular county in a day. Kenya is administered through counties. We have 47 different counties, and of course, one national government. Who are these actors who are driving this market? We see that we are having like a mafia style outfit that have taken advantage over time in setting up and controlling this market unabetted due to a very prolonged absence of regulation and control measures. The first unequivocal legislation on sand in guidelines in Kenya was actually in 2007. My study has placed a typology to understand the structure and actors of these sand cartels, and we see that these actors involve state officials, transport companies, loaders, and brokers. The cartels are organized. Of course, they receive protection from state actors. They're territorial, they're extremely violent, and in conflict sometimes among themselves and also with the community. So we see like an intricate web, a very busy, intricate web of actors in the sand value chain. Corruption, of course, is pervasive, and government officials are involved in this sand trade. We see senior state officials like politicians as stakeholders in the trade. I mean, this is a very different connotation. Being a stakeholder in a trade means you're actively involved in that particular activity. I have mentioned that these cartels are territorial. There's a lot of gang violence involved in the sand mining activity. My study also places that in one site where sand is mined, you can have up to 8 gangs. Sand is mined either in rivers, in lakes, or in land pits. So in one particular river passing through one area, you can have 8 gangs actively, mining sand. And the violence between them happens at very different levels, and the threshold, of course, also varies. The second finding on the impact of sand mining on what it has had on the environment and people's livelihoods, we see that it is destroying ecosystems, and this is having multiplier effects on others. Primary to this loss, of course, is the loss of biodiversity, where birds that rely on water sources either die or relocate to other ecosystems for survival. And when this happens, trees and other vegetations around the sand ecosystems also wither. The surrounding land eventually becomes bare and loses its productivity, hindering activities such as farming that is relied as a source of income by many communities in sand-producing areas. I won't say much on the impact of sand harvesting has had on ecosystems, as it manifests itself everywhere where this practice takes place. We see this in Indonesia, where 24 islands disappeared, being totally mined out. We see this in India playing out. We see this in China also. So it is really evidence on the negative impact it has had on the environment. And sand in Kenya is gotten from the rural parts of the counties and commercially sold in urban cities such as Nairobi, Kisumu, Mombasa, Nakuru, and what have you. Most of the people living in sand producing areas engage in the trade as an avenue to earn income and keep them off absolute poverty. And poverty is vicious. And reducing it has remained very complex, especially in rural population where poverty is quite pervasive. Again, we see that sand trade is a male-dominated and driven industry, with women and girls supporting the trade in the periphery. I think it's very important to look at the gender dimension of sand mining. We see that directly women sell food to loaders in sand sites, and seldom women may engage in other activities like sharpening shovels, washing sand trucks, and what have you. Indirectly, though, sand has enhanced the involvement of women, especially girls, in commercial sex work. Since the sand business is cash-based and largely informal due to lack of regulation, sand loaders and brokers earn on a daily basis after work. Lastly, also, we see that the sand trade is a youth enterprise, and most children who don't continue with higher education engage in it. All you need to start in the sand business is a simple shovel, and you are in. The industry is labor intensive, of course, and children are involved in mining sand in wooden canoes by dredging sand in very fast moving waters without any protective gears. Recently we see with the erratic school closures during the COVID-19 pandemic, it is observed that most children have engaged in the sand trade. The disruption of learning with schools opening and closing abruptly, I hope it doesn't happen again now with this new variant. But we see that this is one of the drivers that enable children to focus entirely on the sand trade. It might be a challenge really to get the children back, to school. And to conclude, Kiran, really is to ask critical questions of what can be done to stop or rather mitigate sand mining, and why should it be done? On what can be done is that part from the negative impact the practice is having on the environment and people's lives and livelihoods. Sand harvesting and trading can not only be regulated, but can also be a top revenue earner for local authorities while providing employment opportunities, thus reducing the youth bulge. And why should we do this? Is that with lack of a formidable alternative, sand remains our only option for the advancement of human civilization. There are still alternative sources of sand, but nothing yet has replaced sand in terms of volume, in terms of the unique properties it has in the construction industry. And sand, unlike charcoal or any other illicit product, is very unique. But this has to be done through a very comprehensive framework that will need to weed out the criminality involved and make the sector crime-proof. And governments need to put in place, proper sand harvesting, utilization, conservation, and trading legislations, in place. Ladies and gentlemen, what I've described today is not unique to the East Africa region, but this form of exploitation is happening everywhere around the world. It's happening in Cameroon, it's happening in the Asian subcontinents, it's happening in other regions here in Africa. And with that, I would request to stop and hand it back to you, Kiran. And thank you once again for finding time to attend this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. That was an excellent talk, very informative. We don't often think about the nuance between harvesting and mining, and so it's quite interesting to think about this non-renewable resource and how we use it. Also interesting was a gender perspective. We don't often see these kind of discussions coming up to the fore, and I think it's so very important. So now let's move on to our next speaker. Our third speaker for the day is Abdelkader Abdelrahman. He's a senior researcher in the ENAC program in Dakar. Before joining the Institute of Security Studies, Abdelkader worked as an independent researcher. And before that position, he also worked as a consultant for Waterland Risk. Abdelkader holds a master's in international relations from the University of Durham and a bachelor in politics and geography from the School of Oriental and African Studies. Over to you, Abdelkader.
Thank you, Karen. Good day, everyone. So my talk will simply, I think that Mohammed has made it easy for me. He's paid away to talk about sand trafficking, which, as he said, is a key issue not only in Kenya, but in many parts in Africa and in Asia or elsewhere. So my focus will be on Morocco. And I would really focus on how this issue of sand trafficking is permitted and facilitated by different components within the Moroccan system. So to start with, sand extraction in Morocco underlines a really deeply rooted political and socio-economic web of illegal activities, such as corruption, and then lack of construction safety and transnational commerce. It also and very importantly, increases the degradation of the environment, putting the vulnerable coastal ecosystem at risk. Despite all this, and despite the tremendous impact sand trafficking in Morocco has, it's really difficult to point out those responsible behind this trafficking. One reason for that is that naming people is very difficult, and it's also, as I was explained, perceived as a taboo. One reason for that is that some people who are involved or who might be involved have very official activities. So investigating sand trafficking in Morocco as a result is really difficult and can be dangerous. And yet, if the authorities don't do anything for that, if they do not tackle the issue of sand trafficking, the result for that would be a tremendous negative impact on the tourism industry, on which the Moroccan economy depends on. So next slide, please. So broadly speaking, when I conducted my work on Morocco sand trafficking, I would say that sand trafficking in Morocco is understudied, especially from a criminal perspective. There's sand trafficking is allowed and facilitated, at least, by a traditional political system. It's sand trafficking also underlines gray areas and loopholes in which companies, from which companies benefit. As I was saying, sand trafficking, it's difficult to name people behind this. There's also this issue of lobbying from construction and cement companies, which work hand in hand with sand. So, as I was saying before, if nothing is done, Moroccan beaches may disappear in the long term, and which would also mean less tourists visiting the country. Having said that, and as Mohammed was saying, what can be done when it comes to sand trafficking? And one issue is to look at alternative materials and techniques which already exist in other parts of the world. Next slide, please. So construction sector is booming in Morocco, and 60% of the Moroccan population lives on the littoral, where 50% of the tourism capacity is also concentrated. At least 55% of the sand sold on the Moroccan national market comes from the illegal coast of sand. And as I was saying, it has a very devastating impact on the environment. One thing has to be said is that many places that have been impacted in the past years are part of what the Moroccan government called the Plan Azur, which meant to bring 10 million tourists by 2010. However, all those places have been disfigured by this sand trafficking. Next slide, please. Sand trafficking is also related to violence. We can get illegal roadblocks near illegal sand mining. There's a clear appetite for criminals, enterprises, and individuals alike. There's intimidation, harassment, and and overall, there's also what some people would call sand mafia, which is operating with no scruples, ignoring roadblocks, and even killing people on their way. But this is something that is not related to Morocco only, and it happens elsewhere in Kenya, in Asia, and many other places. Next slide, please. So one thing we have to understand is that this trafficking is also based on a very large basis. The Moroccan system is based on what is called the Makhzen, which is a very complex territorial system made of regions, provinces, and prefectures. There are 12 regions and 75 provinces. These provinces are themselves divided into hundreds of communes or small cities and villages. And this is how the system works. And basically, there's basically a web of intertwined territory which is further strengthened by a pyramidal political economic system, which in fine facilitates the presence of loopholes fertile for all kinds of trafficking. Next slide, please. So as I was saying, this system allows all sorts of trafficking impunity. For instance, when I was there, I visited some places and roads which were not meant to be closed off were indeed closed off. There were guards there preventing anyone from entering the site. There were policemen preventing from approaching that site, whereas there was no reason whatsoever to go there and to visit that coastal site. And this really underlines that it's not only a mafia, but there's also a corruption that facilitates this trafficking over there. Next slide, please. So as I was saying, sand trafficking is a very sensitive issue in Morocco, and it's almost a taboo. Basically, as someone was telling me, we can talk about the places of exploitation, where it happens, the cost has gone up or down, but we cannot talk about the owners. And one reason for that is that, as I was saying, some officials may be there, may be involved in that. Overall, it is said that 45% of the sand of Moroccan beaches are controlled by and run by mafia syndicates. Sand trafficking is also the prey for drug barons, as they use their drug money earnings to proceed with money laundering with sand quarries and sand and construction companies. Truck transports sand almost every night in very open manner. It's really impossible not to see those transports, which can be counted for hundreds of lorries per night. But yet, it seems that no one is preventing this. Next slide, please. There's also this issue of lobbying. Cement companies can be indirectly involved in sand trafficking. One reason for that is that cement companies, in order to fabricate and to make concrete, which is made of sand, water, and cement, therefore, cement companies, to some extent, need that sand to be for their business to be pursued. Next slide, excuse me, please. So, as a conclusion, I would say that illegal sand extraction in Morocco remains a core issue the government must tackle, as if nothing is done, Moroccan beaches will be disfigured. They would even disappear, with the consequence of less foreign tourists visiting Morocco, and with the dramatic environmental consequences on the Moroccan and beyond ecosystem. Ironically, as I was saying, most of the places that have been affected by the sand trafficking in Morocco are those that were part of the Plan Azur conducted by the Moroccan government. These places today are deeply affected, disfigured, and eroded, with a place like La Rache being a clear example of this disfiguration, where dunes have literally disappeared. It also underlines that before being a legal and environmental issue, this sand trafficking is a political one, as it is a question of development strategy. Moroccan authorities surely bear heavy responsibility in this issue of sand trafficking, and especially on the environmental and economic situation related to this. But beyond sand, it is an entire system of corruption that is in place in Morocco that has to be tackled as part of this solution. But yet, in order to do that, there is also this issue of pyramidal nature of the system, which facilitates sand trafficking in Morocco. So, as Mohammed was saying earlier, there are alternatives, and one thing one has to do is to really think of what could be the best practices for sand trafficking to stop in Morocco, but elsewhere in the world. This is it for today, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Abdulkader. That was a very enlightening and enriching presentation. So we have some questions here. The question being from Lucia to Abdulkader. The question is, do you have knowledge about sand trafficking in Senegal, where the construction business is booming?
I don't have I have an idea on Senegal, but not only on Senegal, but in the West Coast, in West Africa. Sand mining, illegal sand mining in West Africa, in Ghana, in Senegal exists. It prevails. It has, just as in Morocco, a very tremendous negative impact. To what extent, I cannot say at this stage, but for sure, this is an issue. As Mohammed was saying, as I said, it's not an issue related to Morocco only, but to Senegal, to Ghana, to Kenya, and other places in Africa.
And Lucia also asked the same question to Mohammed about Sudan. Would you know about the sand trafficking in Sudan?
I don't know really, but I just want to marry that with two pointers as a pickup also from Abdulkader. I mean, his research really also alludes to cross-border nature of the sand trade. Look, in Africa as a whole, as a continent, this is still an area that is an emerging area, I would say, an emerging crime area, an emerging area on livelihood as a question. We are still looking into how best, what is the scope and scale of this trade. Unlike in Asia, specifically here, I'm mentioning India, I'm mentioning Indonesia, and I'm mentioning China, where we see really the market being extremely pervasive. The actual connotation of terming the actors as mafias really comes out very, very livid. Unlike here in Africa, for example, just to add to what Lucia is mentioning, in Senegal and Sudan, these are two huge countries. The construction boom in Senegal and Dakar, it's live, it's televised. Those who are in Dakar, those who have been there recently will see the boom that is happening in a country like Senegal. The same can be said in Kenya. We have built over 10,000 kilometers of road. We have embarked on some of the most flagship construction in the region, expressways here and there, some very massive dams happening. Nairobi is a huge concrete jungle right now of constructions everywhere. Where does that sand come from? And I'm asking this, not that I have the answer, is that we're talking about a licit program, a licit commodity. Sand is not illegal unto itself. It's not a rhino horn. It's not ivory. It's something that is licit. It's legal. It's like, any other commodity that is there. So really the thin line here to know if this product has been harvested sustainably, because the laws in Kenya don't talk about sand mining, they talk about sand harvesting. It's almost impossible, because once sand is loaded on a lorry, it's already a sold product based on the demands that are there. And before I wind out, is really to look at the cross-border element of this trade. There are indication, maybe still anecdotal, in Uganda, where is another neighboring country where sand mining is pervasive, especially from the Lake Victoria region, that sand is being exported to the neighboring countries of Uganda, and again, quote unquote, still to be founded out further, that is being exported as far as countries like China. So all this is really an understudied area that requires much emphasis at this level. And I don't want to talk much, but let me just mention this as my last rider. Sand is a local issue. It must be governed locally. as much as this debate is going to be discussed at the international forums, at the UN, at the AU, at the regional economic communities, but it remains the duty of the duty bearer, which is the nation state. We cannot regulate sand in Kenya from Geneva or from New York. We can develop the guidelines which are very much needed, but it must be a practice that emanates from the state actors themselves. I'll stop here and get more questions.
Fantastic. Thank you for that very valuable insight. You're absolutely right. This is an issue that is global in nature. It's you see it happening everywhere, yet it manifests differently in different regions, and it must be addressed at the local level. Now, question for you, Oluwole. Since the audience, sand and gravel are critical development minerals. They form up to 60 to 75% of concrete, any concrete composition. But so is coltan. Coltan is a critical mineral that goes into much of our mobile phones and several others. Can you give us some insights into the demand side of the equation, and where is it going? Who's buying all this? Do we have any information on how organized crime networks are interacting with the demand side of the equation?
Thank you so much, Kieran. So since the year 2000, coltan there has been an increase in the demand for coltan. And based on recent scientific developments, the introduction of 5G technology, it has further increased the demand for coltan because it's an essential commodity, mineral that is needed for the capacitor that is being built into some of these modern devices that we're using. And in 2019, 40% of the global supply for coltan was actually derived from the DRC. So it implies that the demand that you have for the mobile devices, for the phone, for the laptop, and all those things that are being developed from European capitals, the United States, Canada, China, Japan, Korea, a greater percentage of the source for this material is actually coming from the DRC. And as the world continues to talk about pilot for alternative energy, coltan is also one of the strategic resources that is going to be part of the landscape in terms of the conversation and in terms of the manufacturing of these essential mobile devices that we are now switching into. So the demand has largely been driven through international supply chain because refining and processing is not actually taking place in the DRC. The only place where some measure of refining is taking place in Rwanda. And Rwanda has far, far less than what is coming from the DRC. As a matter of fact, like I alluded to in the course of my presentation, these countries have become the conduit corridor through which the coltan is actually funneled into the global supply chain. So the demand is huge. The demand will continue. And then there's going to be a lot of rush for the Congolese coltan from the DRC. And then I don't see anything that is going to come in between that in few days to come as a result of the introduction of the 5G technology.
That's interesting. So in terms of the responsible sourcing of coltan, can you give us more information on how, what kind of developments you see in that area?
Yes, in terms of the responsible sourcing of coltan, which also applies to all the strategic minerals in the DRC, there are a number of traceability and certification protocol by the European Union, by the United States of America, called the Dodd-Franklin. I think it was enacted in 2012 or thereabouts, or 11. And as I'm talking to you, about 5 certification protocols have been implemented in the DRC. And that also raises a serious concern in terms of integration and uniformity of certification itself. So what is found in the DRC is that, of course, some of these certification protocols are introduced. And then what you hear at the other end of the tunnel, particularly in the recipient nation, is that certification has been carried out. But when you consider the protracted war economy in the DRC, and that imposes a security challenge to actually accessing this coltan deposit free of conflict, and then you also consider the geography, you also consider the fact that this is one country that is not even integrated with itself, talk less of being integrated to neighboring country in terms of availability of infrastructure, the road network, and all those things to get to the mining site in the first place. So the certification in most places have actually become a ruse, which the actors at the local level will tell you that they are engaging in it. But there's also an element of connivance and organized crime in the process, because basically the process works in a way that there are people who engage in the certification, the civil society organization in conjunction with the business community within the extractive sector. But what happened is that they are supposed to bag and tag some of those minerals, the coltan itself. But the tag is also being traded in the underground economy. So it doesn't matter where you get the tag, as long as your bag is tagged. And then people come out from the bush and say, "Oh, we have tagged the coltan," and then that is the message that is relayed at the upper end of the supply chain in the advanced countries where this mineral is actually being processed into capacitor. So there are limitations that make the certification actually impossible in the DRC, like I identified earlier. And a greater challenge within this spectrum is what is tied to limited statehood. In terms of state presence in places where this mineral is being explored, it is very, very minimal. So enforcement becomes very difficult, and the monitoring and evaluation of the traceability and certification process also becomes very difficult. So coupled with the underground economy of corruption that is going on. So a limited percentage of the coltan that makes it into the upper end of the supply chain is actually certified, a very limited portion. The other ones that are funneled into the global supply chain comes from these illicit sources that I've mentioned, which is also compounded by the security challenges and other issues within the DRC.
Right. Thank you for that. So now we have another question about illicit, about Western Sahara. And I think this question can be directed to Abdel Kader. I know that you have worked on this. Does sand mining also happen in Western Sahara? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, sand mining. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have an echo. Okay, I'll try to speak. Yeah, sand mining occurs in Western Sahara, and more precisely, it occurs between Western Sahara and the Spanish Canary Islands. There are cargo ships traveling from the port of La Union in Western Sahara to Las Palmas on a weekly basis. Yes, it occurs. And it's been occurring like this for 4 years now.
Can you also help us understand why is that, or why does that matter for those who may not be familiar with the context of Western Sahara, and why does that matter?
Well, when it comes to the Western Sahara, and it's a good question you're asking, yes, the issue of Western Sahara and national resources of Western Sahara is an international issue. As we may or may not know, Western Sahara is an occupied territory by Morocco. So by international law, Morocco is not allowed to extract any national resource from the Western Sahara territory. This happens, just like Moroccan companies or the OCP is involved in extracting national sand from Western Sahara, and which is being transported and bought by Spanish companies in the Canary Islands. So yes, there is this issue of environmental issue when it comes to sand extraction, but also an international legal issue, as by law Morocco is not allowed to extract any sand or any national resource from the Western Sahara.
We have a question from an anonymous question. So this is open to either Mohammed or Abdul Qadir. Do you know where European countries such as the UK get their sand from? Are they complicit in the corruption associated with the sand trade is the question. Either whoever wants to address this question.
Maybe Mohammed?
I can go first on that. I do not have any authoritative information on that, on how the sand trade is regulated, not only in the UK, but in Europe or in Americas. We produce a very empirical and evidence-based research before we communicate some of our findings. But in the media, we see that most of these unregulated sand harvesting practices are rampant in Africa and again in the Asian continent. That will be my response here.
Would you like to add to that, Abdul Qadir?
Not really. I mean, just like I don't have any authority to say or to talk about the UK or any place. But the only thing I could say is that sand trafficking is a national, it's also a transnational issue. Just like we mentioned, Spain and Las Palmas and the Canary Islands, Western Sahara, Morocco. But yeah, in Asia, Dubai, the United Arab Emirates, many places. But I cannot add more than that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. When we talk about 13 out of the 20 world's biggest urban cities, urban areas going to be in Africa, we're talking about huge, massive growth there. And how can we ensure that we manage this growth? So all three of you are colleagues at the Institute of Security Studies. And so I imagine you work closely. So I have a question for you, my own question. Do you see any similarities between organized crime networks for sand vis-a-vis coltan? Are there any similarities or really striking differences that you have seen? Open to the floor.
Well, let me quickly take this before the sand researchers make probably a much more connecting point. I would just say, in essence, that for the coltan mining, sand is part of the hard resource. And I think a major environmental despoilation that is actually taking place in the DRC as a result of the illicit mining and trading of coltan is actually the despoilation of the environment, and soil is affected in this regard, which I believe to a large extent is part of the of art resource. Which ties to sand. And what you find out is that in terms of similarity, I think, like I've read in the unpublished, yet to be published report of the two, Mohammed and Abdurrahman, what is important is that some of these places where this illicit extraction is taking place, what you find out is that it creates a pool, it creates multiple potholes. When it rains, then you have cesspools in those places, and then that becomes a breeding ground for mosquitoes, which is a major challenge, which poses a major health challenge in the sub-Saharan Africa. And then it has a direct effect on the health of the people within those local environments. And then by extension, places where the soil has actually been despoiled in those places become very, very unuseful for agricultural purposes. And then everything is just about environmental degradation that leads to loss of biodiversity, poses health risk to the people, and then also affects the agricultural practices in those places. So that is a bit of link between coltan mining that is done illicitly, and then environmental despoilation, which also relate to destruction of the environment in terms of sand resource within those places.
I can go next on that. The DRC is a very unique, I don't know if we can call it really a subcontinent inside a continent, because One of the biggest black market route that really spans from the DRC, where you have an intricate, very complex criminal actors involved in timber, in wildlife products, in resources like coltan gold that Wale is looking at. And I wouldn't be surprised if you also have sand actors that are there. The DRC is in the eastern part of the continent. It's connected to the western part, the southern part, central part. It's everywhere, and it's a beehive of activity. And this really black market belt in Africa cannot be talked about without really looking at what really goes on at the DRC. In 2009, the World Bank estimated that the profits from a transnational organized crime in Africa that move through the political economy stood at $1.3 billion US. 2 years later, in 2011, we saw a 50% growth on that, growing to a $3.3 billion US. Really unpacking some of these connections between the different forms of criminal markets is still an area to be explored further. And as the ENACT program, we are continuously using our regional organized crime observatory, exploring some of this interconnection between the different, the relation between the different criminal markets. I would like also to finally add that we have developed an organized crime index that is a very useful tool to look at the impact of transnational organized crime in Africa that spans around over 10 different criminal markets, who are the 4 different type of actors that drive these markets. You have the criminal networks, the entrepreneurs, the state mafias, the mafias and the state embedded actors. And then we also measure the resilience that governments use to look at the different criminal markets in the continent. I'm going to post the link in the chat box. It's an extremely useful tool. We just launched the 2021 version that you can explore the different types of criminal markets that operate in Africa. Thank you.
Would you like to add anything to that, Abdul Qadir?
Just one point. I mean, just as I was saying in my presentation, criminals on sand trafficking, they're involved in. They're very flexible. They work on sand trafficking, but if they have any window of opportunity on other things, they would do it. Just like in Morocco, I mean, some drug traffickers are involved in sand trafficking, or at least in the sense that they use sand trafficking for money laundering. So I think that criminals are very flexible. They can be creative, and yes, it happens there. It happens, I think, in many other places.
So you've mentioned how there's a cement lobby, and that criminal networks might be involved in money laundering in construction through sand quarries. Do you see this kind of, is that specific to Morocco, or do you see it also happening in other parts of Africa?
Well, again, I haven't studied other parts of Africa to say whether there is a lobbying of cement companies, and surely there is a niche here to look at. But the question is there to ask, and there could be. But again, I cannot say whether I can give you a firm answer on that.
Mohammed, do you have anything to add to that?
Not really.
Okay.
We see some of the biggest emerging economies in Africa, in the world, some of the fastest growing cities and some of the fastest growing economies are located in Africa. Ethiopia is an example. Rwanda, Uganda, Kenya, and this really accompanies a massive construction appetite in terms of civil infrastructure, in terms of any type of infrastructure that you're going to talk about. And 2 ingredients there are key: limestone, of course, for cement, and sand. That would be my submission, Kira.
And we're talking about multinational organizations rather than local ones. Is that correct?
Both.
Both.
Yeah, both.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. That's interesting. So I'd like to talk about, we have limited time left, so I'm going to see if there's any question. All right, so another question is, the islands disappearing off the coast of Indonesia have already been mentioned. Is there any sign of this kind of environmental impact occurring in Africa in terms of coastal erosion or increased flood risks?
Hard to tell. It's more of a scientific question, really. But one thing we know that environment is not choosy. Environmental impacts it's not really a choosy question. We have seen debates on issues of climate change and issues of environment that if it happens in one place, it's a collective impact in the world. We saw that in tsunami. We saw that in many different types of calamities that have taken place. I don't have an authoritative, scientific response to this. If the impact of islands that have disappeared as a result of man-made practices like sand mining in Asia having a direct impact in Africa, but based on the general concept of the impact of climate change having a global effect, I would say that there may be indications that what happens in other places can indirectly or directly impact other regions, such as Africa.
Okay, I know for sure that there is definitely research happening. I think Snousy et al. Might be the researcher to look for coastal erosion. She's done some research in Morocco in particular. There's also other research happening, but I can't recall the names immediately. Maybe I can share them with Abdulkader and he can then share them with the rest of the audience if you have questions. Yep. So now I would like to bring to the fore the gender perspective, because I think that's really important. When you talk about the Sustainable Development Goals and the 17 goals, women are often at the heart of, they're very vulnerable and they are impacted, whether it comes to minerals such as coltan or sand and gravel. So if you can talk a bit more about the impact of these kind of activities on minerals, on women, and how do you think, and also children dropping out of education to get into mining, and that's a huge problem for the development of the region, of the people. So how do you think we can address this? It's open to the floor, all of you.
This is an issue. I mean, I always believe that when you look at sand mining or whatever trafficking it is, called coltan, all these issues are intertwined. I mean, poverty brings this trafficking as well. And in the case of Morocco, for instance, this issue of children involved in sand trafficking is a key issue, because many children there are involved. They're working for very little, something like 5 euros per day for long hours, 12 hours, 14 hours per day. They're obviously, they're missing school, and their future is really dark, really very somber, since all they have is working in poverty and remaining in poverty. So this is an issue that has to be tackled. But I guess there are other intertwined issues that have to be bring along. I mean, we're talking about education. We're talking about raising awareness of education. So this is the case for Morocco, but I guess this is the case for many other places. But perhaps Mohammed would like to add something on that.
I mean, I would add on the same lines, specifically on the relationship of the involvement of women and poverty. I know Wole will really speak on the issues of the involvement of children. He covers this very extensively in his report, and also has published pieces on the involvement of children in coltan mining. But we see both in flora and fauna crimes that this happen at the local levels, and most of the time they happen in, for lack of a better word, rural, semi-arid, arid places where some of these reserves are still present. And we see the involvement of women really at the periphery levels, in the sense that mining, extractive of natural resources, is an extremely male-dominated industry in all levels, in the extraction part, in the movement part, and in the trading part. We see that men are really involved in all those levels. And we see that women play a role at the peripherals of these value chains, if you would like. I will stop here and maybe pave way for Oluwole.
Thank you so much, Kira, and thank you, Mohammed. I think in terms of the role that women are playing within the mining, or what to tag as maybe criminal economy, they play multiple roles, and they are also the only thing that I think is very striking that I most quickly underscore is the fact that they within the value chain, they represent the vulnerable group who have to take to the trading because of the certain socio-economic disequilibrium that they're experiencing. And there are also women who have become part of the big cartel that are actually engaging in the illicit economy. For the case of DRC, there are prominent names that have been mentioned in UN reports since 2000 up to 2020, who have been women who have been engaging in the illicit trading of strategic minerals like gold, diamond, and coltan. But much more, as far to the extent to which that is an established criminal economy, it's also important to look at the plight of the vulnerable women who go to wash the minerals, who sell food on the mining site, who have been at the recipient of the plight, such as gender-based violence that have been reported on mining sites, and then infection of communicable diseases such as HIV/AIDS, which is also prevalent within the on the mining site. So they represent both the criminal actors at a very minute scale, but much more in terms of bearing the brunt of illegal mining and illicit trading of strategic minerals like the coltan. They are actually vulnerable. And that also extends to the children. About 40,000 children are engaged in child mining within the DRC, on coltan mining, gold, diamond mining, and they are also vulnerable. Some of them are out of school children. Some of them have been victim of pervasive poverty in the country, and they have to take to this. So on the final analysis, it affects the developmental outcomes in their environment, and it also impacts on their quality of life. And some of them have also been kidnapped by armed group. I'm talking about these vulnerable children, and taken to the bush to join the rebel armies in Eastern DRC. So it's a mixed bag in terms of the gender role and the effect of these illicit activities, particularly on the vulnerable groups.
Thank you very much for that enlightening discussion. We're really rapidly coming to a close. We have one last question before I give you the opportunity for your closing remarks. Lucia asks, Mohammed mentioned the term sand harvesting as used in Kenyan law versus sand mining. Could you elaborate briefly on the implications of both terms? If you can keep your answer brief, that would be great. Mohammed, over to you.
Yes, I think as I earlier mentioned, harvesting really connotes a replenishing cycle in place. Sand really forms when rocks wither, and then it's washed down to the sources, which is mainly water sources like rivers, lakes, and land pits. But a journey of 10,000 years can actually, you can mine the entire sand in less than a year, So, and that's why that indicates that the replenish rate and the mining rate do not match. Even though sand is a non-renewable resource, it has been forced based on human practices to become a finite resource that, once you mine it out, it becomes impossible to get the right levels back.
Thank you very much. And so we are now very shortly about to end this session. Before I end the session, I'd like to give you the opportunity to give any closing remarks that you might have. Over to you, Oluwole. Let's go with the same order.
Okay, I think my closing remark is going to revolve around the need to muster multi-stakeholder engagement in terms of advocacy reform that we need within this extractive sector. It fits into the broader conversation and theory about resource costs. Some of the direct brunt is borne by the local people in these communities where this extractive process is taking place. And more often than not, their voices are not heard. And we have the intellectual responsibility to escalate this to a global audience that might have one or two things to do as far as those solutions are concerned. As long as the criminal actors are making the money, it's also important to underscore the fact that the local people, the community people, their plight needs to be addressed. And it has to be multilateral, business community, the civil society, the media, the academic community. We have to put pressure on the states to act in the interest of the people and mobilize political power to actually drive the necessary reform that will reflect in the quality of life of the people that are found around this mining and extractive community. Thank you.
And thank you very much. Over to you, Mohammed.
I'll say two things. One is that as is right now, we don't have an alternative to sand. A formidable alternative to sand, we don't have it. So we really need to rethink on how best we're going to live with this product. Why? Because it's the most used resource. It's the second most used resource in water. And Africa right now, it's a theater of constructions. And the top ingredient of that is sand. So we must look for ways to live with it. Second, we must regulate sand at these local levels and look for ways that we can actually put in place guidelines and frameworks, authorities that can regulate the sand trade. Those will be my 2 pointers, Kiran.
Okay. Thank you very much. I would challenge the no alternative speech, but you're right, absolutely, they need to be developed. Over to you, Abdulkader, for your for your final remarks.
Just one point. I just hope that all those who have attended this session today, just to remind them that not to see sand the way they might have perceived it before that. I just hope that from now on, when they go on holiday, be it in Morocco, in southern Spain, or wherever, laying on the beach, enjoying the sun, I just hope that they will see sand differently. That's all I could say.
Absolutely. So that brings us to the end of this session. I would like to thank each of the panelists for your really insightful presentations and your discussions. I would also like to thank the Secretariat team who has been working behind the scenes. It was organizing this, handling questions, managing the whole flow of the event. Thank you very much to the audience members for joining us and for submitting your questions. I hope you enjoyed this particular session. Look forward to seeing you in other sessions. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the OC24 podcast. For more talks, have a look at the podcast feed on whichever platform you use. There are loads more to listen to. Video versions of these talks are also available on the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime YouTube channel. If you would like to share these talks around, we ask that you use the hashtag OC24 and let us know what you think. The 24-hour conference on global organised crime is brought to you by the European Consortium of Political Research Standing Group on Organised Crime, the Centre for Information and Research on Organised Crime, the International Association for the Study of Organised Crime, and the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. For more information, head over to oc24.globalinitiative.net. This has been the OC24 podcast from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. Thanks for listening.